Aaron Paul never said his iconic B-word catchphrase, 0 out of 10 episode, I'm sorry. Invincible Season 3 has already been doing a really solid job at putting Mark in these different dilemmas where he's questioning his own moral code, and Season 3's newest episode continues that trend in a very compelling way, in my opinion, specifically with the introduction of the series' newest villain, Scott Duvall, otherwise known as Powerplex. Obviously, with how the world is portrayed in the show, it can't be seen in black and white, especially in the superhero supervillain scene, how these villains are created or how the heroes choose to deal with the different crimes some of these criminals commit. Mark is constantly at odds with how he should be handling these incredibly delicate and complicated situations, with his fight against Angstrom at the end of Season 2 being one of the main catalysts for this, but the way this episode uses Powerplex takes us all the way back to Season 1 events, specifically Mark's fight with his father and all the destruction it caused in the city of Chicago. So rather than a general breakdown of the episode as a whole, I wanted to use this video to focus on Powerplex's dynamic with Mark and breaking down the problems with how he decides to go about his revenge against Mark. Also, light spoiler warning for not only the contents of this episode, but a bit of what's to come from the comics. Let's go. The episode opens with Powerplex, aka Scott Duvall, visiting his sister and niece Gretchen in Chicago for Gretchen's 10th birthday. But we learn during their walk in the city that this is taking place at the same time as Mark and Nolan's big fight at the end of Season 1, where Nolan used Mark against his will to kill thousands of people. Scott in particular went to grab a coffee and was knocked unconscious by the impact of Mark and Nolan hitting the streets. When he awoke, he was devastated to find the lifeless bodies of both his sister and niece under a bunch of building rubble, simultaneously watching Nolan carry Mark back into the sky for the remainder of their fight in the mountains. And due to the lack of support from the district attorney about Mark having to pay for the damage he caused, Scott would take matters into his own hands, using his powers of energy absorption and electrokinesis to plan a revenge plot meant to kill Mark for the loss of not only Scott's family members, but the other lives lost that day as well, officially dubbing himself as Powerplex. First off, I really like how they incorporated a more noteworthy villain that was directly connected to the Chicago incident, because I'd argue that even now, with everything Mark has been through, specifically in the show so far, what happened to that day with his dad is still the most traumatic thing he's gone through. Finding out his own father, the guy Mark was aspiring to be like his whole life, was the complete opposite person everyone thought he was, that same dad beating the ever-loving hell out of him and forcing him to partake in involuntary manslaughter of thousands of innocents. All the while, Mark is still just a kid who still hadn't even had his powers for that long at this point. He's the one other major villain besides Angstrom that was created out of the consequences of Mark's actions. But here's the thing. While Scott was obviously ignorant about what was actually happening and shouldn't have been expected to know what happened due to his position in society, well, that's partially true because this guy actually works for the GDA and eventually learned everything there is to know about Mark and presumably Viltrum's plan to take over, yet he's still hyperfixated on taking Mark down more than the imminent alien invasion. Sure, why not? At the end of the day, Mark didn't really have a choice in the matter given the situation at hand. It was either stand up to his dad long enough to wear his mental down because obviously Mark can't win physically, or submit to Nolan and the rest of Viltrum. Problem with that scenario though is Season 2 showed us, and by extension Angstrom Levy, tons of dark futures where Mark did go along with Viltrum's plan. In every single instance, parts of humanity would naturally resist in giving up their freedom, which would in turn cause even more deaths on Earth overall than the one Chicago incident. I mean, hell, even Nolan tried putting the blame on Mark during that fight, saying, "Why did you make me do this?" and things of that nature. So while it was technically in a twisted way Mark's fault that these people died, he did what he had to do for what he believed what was for the greater good, which has not only been a big theme in the show overall, but even more prominent in Season 3 with characters like Cecil getting into it with Mark about the moral code of heroes / the other people who are trying to defend Earth from threats. And to give Powerplex a tiny bit of credit here, he did at least try to solve the matter in the most traditional sense before losing his shit completely. The problem here is, the way this character went about his revenge on Mark was, well, incredibly reckless and stupid to an extent. The act of revenge in fictional media can be definitely seen as justified within the context of said show, given the circumstances leading up to the revenge. I think a decent example of this is Alex Mahone's revenge against company assassin Wyatt from the show Prison Break. Mahone started off as an antagonistic force against the show's main characters, but as more time passed, we the audience learned pretty much everything he'd done was at the mercy of the company so he could keep his wife and young son safe, eventually defecting from his role as a pawn in their scheme and joining sides with Michael Schofield. So now that he was on the more just side, and an objectively bad person like Wyatt murdered Mahone's 5-year-old son in cold blood, seeing Wyatt get his just desserts was incredibly satisfying. A guy like that didn't deserve to be walking free in that show's version of society. Figured I'd use Mahone as an example here as a way to show it's not always the people who are on the good or just side from the get-go that can still have satisfying moments of revenge against forces even worse than they ever were. The first issue with Powerplex's plan is the way he decides to get Mark's attention. After his wife injects his body with those biotherm discs, Powerplex goes into the city streets, causing a ruckus, claiming he didn't want to hurt anyone and just wanted one-on-one one-on-one time with Mark. But jumping off a building to boost your powers, dude, you could have easily landed on a car or caused, other kinds of accidents in the process by doing that. Not gonna lie, when they were doing the title card bit, I thought my Prime player was bugged for the first 2 instances of it.
Why is above the law? Why does never pay?
Things get worse when Shapesmith shows up to deal with Powerplex, where his energy absorption caused some extra collateral damage, resulting in Shapesmith getting knocked out, some parts of buildings being destroyed, and onlookers terrified of Powerplex. For a moment, it feels like Powerplex is actually seeing the error of his ways and how much destruction his powers can cause, and trying to plead with the crowd that how he generally didn't want to fight back against Shapesmith, quickly escaping soon after. But instead of using this as, a lesson about how maybe this plan to take down Mark might not be very ideal, he just continues to crack the intensity levels up each time. Though in a way, we do kind of learn how similar Powerplex is to Mark in a sense. Both of these guys are extremely family-oriented. After all the pain Mark and his mother have suffered because of Nolan and to a lesser extent Angstrom Levy, Mark himself showed he was willing to take drastic measures against those who threatened his family's safety. Whereas Scott already lost 2 people who were just as close to him as Debbie and Oliver are to Mark, so it makes me wonder if there was another version of Mark out there that went through a similar situation and became a villain as a result. If that did happen in the comics, you can just spoil me on it. I honestly don't care. The way I've consumed the Invincible comics has been really weird in general. Like, I know the names and designs of some of the major upcoming characters who may not even appear until season 4, but I don't know a lot of the specifics of what goes on with each interaction with said characters, if that makes sense. And one day I'll fully catch up to it, but I'll leave that for a later date. Powerplex's next plan involves the memorial service that's taking place for all the lives lost in the Chicago Massacre. Mark, the rest of his family, and Eve in attendance, of course. Hijacking the speech to get Mark to fight, but Eve stops Mark from intervening to take care of it herself. I gotta say, the little skirmish they had really goes to show how strong Powerplex can be the longer a fight goes on. That guy was breaking Eve's barriers with his bare hands like nothing. Multipol couldn't even brute force his way out of that. It also makes me glad to see Mark, actually acknowledging the lives that were taken during that incident. Until now, and with everything else going on in the story, the actual deaths that occurred that day were starting to feel like an afterthought in a sense. And this is why Mark is such an interesting and entertaining character for me. Because of scenes like this, questioning the world around him and see how he learns to deal with these, certain scenarios based on the experiences that make him question right and wrong. And Mark thinking to himself, do I actually deserve to be exempt from so many things just because I can fly and lift heavy objects? Now, the main act that really sent Powerplex over the edge was his third and final plan to get Mark's attention, which was using his wife and infant son as fake hostages, claiming he'll kill them if Mark doesn't actually show up this time. Powerplex is clearly becoming more unhinged as the episode goes on, that's for sure, but I'd argue his wife is just as insane, because she didn't have the common sense to realize that putting herself and her innocent baby in danger probably isn't the best idea in the world. She's just blatantly enabling this unhinged behavior and lacks the self-awareness to realize how out of hand this whole revenge plan has gotten. Mark eventually shows up to their location, which was intentionally chosen as the old building where Scott's sister and niece lived. Mark tries to reason with Scott and apologize for what he's done, but it's clear Scott is already too far gone, willing to fight Mark in such close quarters despite his wife and child being right there, and not backing down to the point where he does get Mark in his clutches and unleashes an insanely powerful energy wave, one that wasn't powerful enough to flat out kill Mark, of course, but unfortunately for Scott, it did take the lives of his wife and son. These are the consequences of his actions, becoming so obsessed with wanting to avenge lost loved ones that he ended up losing everything else he still had left in the process. Now stuck in prison with no family and no signs of wanting to ease back into reality, even behind bars with Mark trying to level with him more, all Scott can think about is how one day he'll break out and finally get to kill Mark like he's wanted this whole time. And even though they weren't given names at the time of the incident, we see Mark did actually try to save these 2 ladies specifically out of anybody in the actual season 1 episode. So it's kind of sad to know that if Scott wasn't knocked out cold by the initial impact of Mark hitting the streets, then maybe he could have seen Mark trying to actively save the lives of Jessica and Gretchen. A very solid episode overall. Even though Powerplex's actions were unbelievably misguided, his feelings are at least valid to a degree. He has every right to be grieving his lost loved ones, especially after losing them in such a horrific manner. Aaron Paul did a really great job at voicing him too. Just about every single line of dialogue from this character was delivered with such raw emotion. Animation was definitely a bit choppy at times, but I'm just used to it at this point. I'm in the camp of, season 1 will still probably be the best looking season of Invincible until further notice. But I'm still looking forward to these next 2 episodes, with the return of Angstrom, the different evil versions of Mark, and hopefully my favorite old man conquest. I think there's grounds for some very entertaining and hype content here. I know I'm a bit tardy to the party when it comes to videos on the show. I don't really have a good reason as to why I haven't made any videos on the show yet, outside of my own stupidity. And for God's sake, the main character is the same name as me. Like, I gotta be stupid for sport. So if you'd like to see more videos from me on Invincible, definitely be sure to leave a like down below and subscribe for more future content. But for now, I will see you guys next time. Peace out, take care, bye-bye.